Good evening, viewers. I'm Rabia Akhtar, Director, Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research at University of Lahore. We are here with another edition of the conversation series by the faculty of the School of Integrated Social Sciences at University of Lahore. Please subscribe to CISP's YouTube to view all our conversations and webinars. I'm really excited about today's session because I'm joined by an old friend. It takes me back to 2005 when I first met her. Let me begin by introducing her and then we'll go back to 2005. Dr. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program and director of the India Project at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Madan's work explores India's role in the world and its foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She also researches the intersection between Indian energy policies and its foreign and security policies. Dr. Madan is the author of a wonderful book which I just finished, Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War, published by Brookings Institution Press. She is currently completing a monograph on India's foreign policy diversification strategy and researching her next book on the China-India-US triangle. In addition to a PhD in public policy from the University of Texas at Austin, she has a master's degree in international relations from Yale University and a bachelor's program with honors in history from Lady Shri Ram College, New Delhi, India. Dr. Tanvi, welcome to our conversation series.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Akhtar, Rabia, and it's good to see you after so many years.
I know it has been so long, so let's give a flavor to our viewers about how we first met. It was Regional Center for Security Strategic Studies, Colombo's platform. It was a summer workshop. And participants from India, China, and Pakistan, young scholars who were working on strategic issues, nuclear issues, were gathered in Lahore. And that's when I first met you. Probably that was your first time to Pakistan as well. And we were roommates. And who knew that like 15 years later, we would be having this conversation, on the strategic dynamics in the region. So I would want you to share your thoughts with our viewers as to what was your first impression and what did you think about RSS as a platform and why in the absence of that there is so much of gap between the scholars and academics who work on these issues of our region. There's just so much of gap that I feel that needs to be filled. Over to you, Tanvi.
Thank you, Rabia. And yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, it was quite funny because we always joke that the RCSS summer workshop, somehow it had gone off track or off the schedule. And it was, I think, about in March or something. And we weren't supposed to meet in Lahore, which is where we had this workshop between kind of Indian, Pakistani, and Chinese participants, kind of early career academics and analysts. I was living in the US at the time, and Steve Cohen had, thanks to him, I had participated. And it was just, for me, from both a professional but also a personal aspect, was a very important visit. I think that the workshop was important because I think it was rare in those days, and in some ways rarer now, to have people from kind of the region, as you said, meet and discuss issues and even disagreements, and to be able to debate them, civilly. Yeah. And I think that's important because even if you don't disagree with somebody, you have to understand other people's perspectives. You might disagree with them fundamentally, but I think it actually makes you a better analyst if you can see, put yourself in the shoes of the other person. And I think, so from a professional perspective, and I think, to be able to actually engage with people from different parts of the world, but also different kinds of, there were people there working on different functional areas. I think it was really important from that aspect. From a personal aspect, both because I got to know people like you, and we wouldn't have come across each other, maybe years later in Washington if you were here for something at another think tank or at Brookings, but we wouldn't have had a chance to get to know each other, roam around, go to food street and things like that. But from a personal kind of family perspective, it was important for me. We weren't, as I said, supposed to meet in Lahore. We were supposed to have that workshop in Murray, I think, and it had snowed, and there was some weather issue. And so I was thrilled. I know the organizers were very pained by that, but I was thrilled because I think you know this, Rabia. Most of my family pre-partition is from Lahore, some are from Girot. And I had grown up hearing all these people in the family talk about Lahore and the, the famous kind of Jine Lahore nahi vekhya, wo jamya nahi.
Yeah.
And so, I always wondered what this, is it nostalgia, but, it's very much connected to those memories. And so for me to actually be able to visit, to roam around, my grandfather, maternal grandfather at the time now passed away, but at the time was still alive. I made him draw me a map of, where their house had been and all the places he used to hang out. And I think the highlight of my Lahore trip was going and visiting Government College Lahore, where my grandfather had been before he joined the Punjab Civil Service. And the alumni office there was great, showed me around, including in the assembly room, where I actually found a couple of photographs of him in the sports teams and the Hindi team, I think. Amazing. So all in all, I think, it's a visit that stays with me. I'm glad for the relationships I made, including with some other, Indian scholars who I would not have come across. So it's always wonderful. And I can't believe it's been 15 years, but it has.
15 years, yes. And I'm also in touch with majority of the cohort from the Indian side. To be honest, we're talking about China today. I sadly don't have a single Chinese friend or memory from that RCSS workshop. So that says a lot. And you mentioned something about, being in another person's shoes. So we did the simulation exercise as well, right? And we were all mixed up in each other's countries and had to play that role. So I think it was an important platform. I hope and pray that RCSS jumpstarts it, and we all, the younger generation that's coming up, it needs to connect with each other so that they can talk and talk about these strategic issues together in an informal setting, and learn from the best in the field. There's so many scholars on both sides, and even in China, that are not introduced personally to this generation. So that's that, but that's a great memory, and I just was hoping to talk a bit about it. So this takes me to my first question. I have so many questions for you. Basically, we'll be talking about your excellent book, which I have speed read. Since the time I got the Kindle edition, because unfortunately Pakistani bookstores are not carrying your book. So I want you to talk to us, because this series is for the students as well as the academics. So we want to keep that flavor, academic flavor to it. I want you to tell us about your studies, about the career paths you chose, and the kind of the research area that you chose. You've visited so many archives, presidential and national archives in the US, extensively, quoted and well researched in your book. What is the importance of history? Because a lot of people find history to be really boring. But for the historians, it is so important to have that lens. And especially this current generation is not so connected. All they want to talk about is contemporary issues without any hindsight, without any knowledge of, how. So your book actually, which we'll talk about later, is a perfect, discussion point to take this forward. So I want you to talk about history and declassification. Pakistan, unfortunately, does not have any declassification policy or act. And in my own work on nuclear history, I had to rely on US sources. But that, at the end of the day, tells me a US story about Pakistan, US non-proliferation story about Pakistan, because Pakistani sources are missing. So I cannot tell a complete story. So I want you to tell our viewers what your experience has been and how did you get to where you are today.
Thanks, Rabia. Excellent questions. And, so just in terms of my career path, I had done my undergraduate degree in Delhi, I had majored in history. And I was always interested, in fact, probably asked too many questions because I was always curious about the past. I loved history, especially well-written history, because it is stories. It's stories, and then you see patterns, and then you analyze from there. But I think it comes from just the kind of child who probably asked why all the time. And so for me, it was kind of a perfect discipline. Is I wanted answers, and I loved reading. And I don't think at that, I didn't have growing up that much access to political science or IR as such. And so history kind of was the what I got into and really enjoyed it. And then worked a couple of years in India, not in history, but I'd always known I wanted to do something in international relations related. And so I ended up coming to the US in 2001 to do my master's at Yale, which was a very kind of eclectic degree. It had history, it had political science, it had economics, it had law. And so there I had a chance to kind of, and I'm a big fan of actually, whether you're a historian, whether you're a political scientist, whether you're an economist, to actually think about some broader disciplines, because I think they make you a better researcher. So sometimes I describe myself as a bit of a mutt, a little bit of a lot, but I think it even helps me as a historian to be aware of the kind of the political science, the IR literature. It helps me kind of organize thoughts more easily. So I would, to students especially, say, disciplines are good, but also think about, these other, it helps you broaden your frameworks. I then worked at the Brookings Institution in Washington for 3 years for the head of the foreign policy program at that time, James Steinberg, but also Steve Cohen, who was very encouraging as well. Then went to do my PhD at UT Austin, as you mentioned. That was a PhD in public policy. So me, who does not like quantitative work at all, was forced to kind of do some of it. But again, it was good for me to be able to broaden my abilities and the instruments I could use to bring it a problem. But I was really interested in kind of looking at US-India relations. There've been a number of books, of course. Dennis Cox's book, he wrote one on US-Pakistan relations too. And of course, Robert McMahon's book, Cold War in the Periphery, and a few other books at that time. But one of the things that I wasn't not quite satisfied with the explanations, and the other thing related to your point about archives, the Indian archives had started becoming more open, at least more papers had started becoming more open. And so I wanted to kind of revisit this question. I was very lucky at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Policy, where I was at at the University of Texas, that the LBJ library was right next door. And so you could wander in and go through files all the time. And that's actually sitting there is where I actually, and this is related to the point about why archives I think are important. As I was kind of going through these files, which are essentially the White House papers, which were kind of more recently available than, say, State Department papers had been. This gave you kind of a perspective of how the Johnson administration has seen things. And I expected to see, it was when the 1965 India-Pakistan war was, etc., that there would be what people have traditionally said, a lot about Pakistan, a lot about the Soviet Union in this US-India context. But what I actually noticed is they kept talking about China and how India couldn't fail as China was succeeding. And that got me interested. So to me, archives, going to them, you can actually put yourself in the position of people who were there at the time. Now, yes, people write memoirs, people write, analysis. You can look at newspapers, which I think are an underused resource. But at the end of the day, I think why archives are important, and why I think governments, in fact, should have an interest in declassifying, is I think it actually allows you, like I was saying earlier, it allows you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody. And I can tell you from what we've seen in India, which is that as there's been more access to, so there've been 2 sets of papers there that there've been kind of access to. There is a declassification policy. It's kind of a 40-year rule. But what was usually happening is ministries weren't either not turning over their files, or they were using national security grounds to say no access. But slowly, kind of the MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs papers were more available at the Indian National Archives. But more importantly, the caches of private papers, personal papers of some key individuals were available in the Nehru Memorial Library, which is people call Murti. And so it's not a complete picture, but it starts to give you a feel for what policymakers at the time in India were thinking about, were facing in terms of constraints. So if you're a government, a lot of government officials often say, you academics and think tank people keep coming up with, you don't understand our constraints. Well, one way of helping people understand what you were facing as you were making these decisions is to actually give people access to those papers. And so I've noticed that if you look at the histories that have been written now, using the Indian archives, they're actually more, I think they are a more accurate picture, of course, but they also are more, I think they give you a sense of why some decisions, they're not about making judgment. As no historians, it's not our job to kind of pass judgment. It is our job to present the picture as people saw it. And I think that's what I would say all governments should keep in mind, is that it actually helps when people who are analyzing your decision making actually understand what you were facing at the time. Otherwise, it will always be seen from another perspective. As you said, a lot of histories were written, but only from the US side. So, I know governments tend to not want to do it because they think people will, judge them or blame, people will have blame games. But I think governments should be more confident about, because you know what, somebody else is going to release papers. For example, on India-China, there was a brief time they're closed again, but China had actually released a lot of its papers on India-China. And so they were setting the narrative. So I think it's important for governments everywhere to remember that this is one way of giving people that insight.
Absolutely. It is about narrative. And once you read one-sided story, then, people in the establishment would read it and say, you've done a half job. And then you turn around and say, well, had you given me access to your side, I would have done a complete job. So I hope, I know India has made great progress in the field of, declassification. And I hope Pakistan also gets there someday. There is hope. One should always be hopeful, and I am forever optimistic. So with this, let me move to your book. It's an excellent book written in a format and style which is easy to read and comprehend, even for somebody who does not have any background in this. I think you've done a wonderful job, so congratulations on that. The title of your book is Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War. I would like for you to talk about the main thesis of your book. It is a historical account. What story does it tell about the China factor in the Indo-US relations? India, when I was reading it, I felt that India had a perception about China which was independent initially and different from how the US viewed China. But later on, that perception did overlap, how US viewed, how India viewed China. So the periods of divergence and convergence and then divergence that you talk about, please just lay it out for our viewers as to how have you, brought out your main thesis.
Rabia, I particularly appreciate you saying that it's readable because that was important to me. My sister, who is an architect, read it, and I read an early draft and pointed out sections, and she said, this is too dense. And so, I went back and changed it. So I do want it to be readable to anybody who wants to read it, not just people in our fields. The book essentially it sparked my interest because, today, for example, we take it for granted that China helps shape US-India relations, that over the last, say, 15, 20 years, as US and India have shared concerns, not about China's rise per se, but there have been concerns about China's actions, that it has driven the two countries together. And you've seen ever deepening, especially security and defense cooperation between the two countries. Partly, not only, but partly in large part, I would say, shaped by this. So we almost assume that this is and Condoleezza Rice, in fact, had said in 2000, just before, in fact, when a foreign affairs piece that the US has viewed India just before she had become National Security Advisor, when she was still out of government, but an advisor to then candidate Bush. She had said the US for far too long has looked at India only through kind of an India-Pakistan dyad, looked at that and looked at it in connection with Pakistan. Well, with China rising, we need to think about India in the context of a rising China. And what my book shows is that this kind of last 20 years, this framework, this thinking about, for the US, thinking about India in the context of China, this is actually something we saw in the early years since kind of 1947 onwards, that it is not new that China has shaped US-India relations. And so the book argues that in fact, since Indian independence, the US has looked at India, and Indian policymakers also, when they thought about the US and that China shaped their thinking about it. Their views of China and their views of the US actually did intersect and interact at points. The book also tries to, you asked about the importance of history. One of the things, especially in this triangle, but if any two countries should know about historical baggage, it's India and Pakistan. But if you think about, even India, China, even India, US, China, historical baggage itself shapes, or history shapes current perceptions. But what I was trying to also do is see, could we learn something about today's context? At the end of the day, I'm a policy analyst. What can we learn about today's triangle from the past? And so the book addresses and tries to look at this question of, is a US-India partnership against China or to balance China, is it inevitable as they see China as a threat? This is something Ambassador Robert Blackwell, when he was ambassador in the mid-2000s, had said, US ambassador to India, that when China appears as a threat, the US and India will naturally come together. And then, the Indian side would often say, look, non-alignment, strategic autonomy, we don't gang up with other countries against, third countries. And so what my book argues, along with China has been playing a role that is neither episodic nor recent in shaping US-India relations, it also argues that the idea that a US-India partnership to balance China is neither inevitable nor impossible. And it talks about the conditions under which the US and India come together against China and when they don't. And that leads me to kind of how the book is structured. So I look at the book, the period I look at is really kind of 1949 through 1979, the first kind of 3 decades. But it really does start in 1947, and it looks at, how the US and India's relationship was shaped by their perceptions of China and how they approach China. And the first, when Prime Minister Nehru first went to the United States in 1949, he received this extremely warm welcome. And President Truman went to receive him at the airport. He took along 3 cabinet members, a guard of honor. And what I found when I was looking in not just the archives, but kind of old newspapers, is that the reason for that was because, according to the US, China had just been lost to communism. And so they were looking at India as a democratic counterbalance and a democratic contrast and a geopolitical counterbalance as the other big Asian country to kind of partner with in this kind of evolving, unfolding Cold War. And while Nehru and Truman talked about 2 issues, basically, when they first met, Kashmir, which we all, we know about that narrative. But the other issue they talked about was China. And what Nehru's visit did in 1949, but we see this then over the next few years in a period that I call divergence, which is from 1949 to about 1955, 1956, the US and India actually had differences on not just how they saw China, but how to actually engage with it or contain it. So the US saw China as hostile, as a partner of the Soviet Union, as a monolithic, part of the monolithic communist bloc, and a country that had to be contained. India had concerns about China, but Prime Minister Nehru argued that no, the best way to actually deal with China was that he said it might be a threat, but it'll be a threat, 10, 15 years from now. And the best way to deal with it right now, because we've got other issues, domestic development, we have to deal with Pakistan. And so the best thing to do is actually engage China, to bring it in to the international community. And he tells Truman this, and we should encourage it to be, in language we would use today, a responsible stakeholder. This divergence wasn't just something they talked about. It actually ended up, particularly as the Korean War played out, and there were key differences between the US and India. It ended up actually having an adverse effect on US-India relations, because both sides saw the other as being difficult and in fact even hindering their broader strategic interests. That's followed by a period of from 1957 to about 1962 of what I call convergence, where, as you alluded to earlier, suddenly India and the US started seeing China much more similarly. The US suddenly saw India or the kind of problem in the Cold War, not just as geopolitical, but ideological as well. So in their mind, and this is when non-aligned countries become more important, first to President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy, they start to see that they cannot let Soviet-backed China succeed economically, militarily, while democratic India didn't succeed. So it became the interests, and there's Republicans and Democrats agreed on this. Eisenhower and Kennedy agreed that they needed to help India win this race against China. And so you see that the US changes its mind and decides India is part of its China. And India starts becoming much more concerned from about 1957, when the road is first discovered that's built through Aksai Chin between Tibet and Xinjiang, that they become which on territory that India had claimed, and still claims, that it had become, China was an increasing threat. They were concerned about Chinese involvement in Nepal. They were concerned about inroads elsewhere. So that actually ends up this kind of general kind of understanding that China was a concern. And then, of course, the Chinese start seeing India as a concern, because when the Dalai Lama escaped, the Tibetan issue comes to the fore in 1959 as well. All this ends up resulting in the US and India coming closer together, US economic assistance, and then eventually military assistance during the 1962 China-India war, and what was called an air defense agreement signed in 1963. The US shared intelligence with India, etc. And so you see kind of this convergence between the two countries. Very quickly, the next phase between 1963 and 1968 or so is when I argue I call it a period of dependence and disillusionment. The two countries still depend on each other. The US needs India to succeed. It needs India as part of this Cold War framework, especially as the war in Vietnam is raging, and they can't have another kind of non-communist country fall, so to speak. While India needed the US to recover from the 62 war, but also for economic reasons. The US poured billions of dollars into India. So they both needed each other. They were dependent on the idea as well as the help of the other. But they've increasingly become disillusioned with each other. While they still agreed China was threat number one, they start disagreeing on what to do about that. So they agree on the ends, they disagree on the approach. How do you deal with it? For the US, there's a sense that India needs to spend more money on development, that the US could take care of its defense. The US also wants to have a more exclusive partnership with India. India wants to diversify its partnerships with the Soviet Union as well, not just with the US. They also disagree on the role of Pakistan. The US tries to convince India, especially during the Kennedy administration, that the end of the Kennedy, that look, and even Johnson tried to some extent and then gave up, that the US and India, that India should actually make up with Pakistan, and together both of them could fight communist China. So the US argued to India that, look, you should see Pakistan as a solution to your China problem. But as China-Pakistan relations start becoming closer in that kind of 62, 60, or particularly from 63 onwards, India starts to see China as part of its Pakistan as part of its China problem. And so you see these disagreements, both US and India start becoming disillusioned with each other's willingness and ability to play a role vis-a-vis the China problem. And so so they're still connected. In fact, there's deep defense and intelligence engagement between India and the US at the time still. There's a lot of economic engagement. But you see the kind of lack of interest by the end of that period. Similar going into the Nixon administration. The first few years of the Nixon administration kind of continue on this dependence and disillusionment line. But then, of course, the 1971 war happens, and the crisis that followed before the war in December 1971. when there's another brief period of divergence, where you see, in this case, India found that it had, one of the things it had with this air defense agreement was an implicit assurance that the US had its back on China. But what it finds in 1971, as Pakistan plays an important role as a channel for the Nixon administration, for Nixon and Kissinger to China, that India finds that the US makes clear it does not have India's back vis-a-vis China. And so India, which thinks there is potentially going to be a war at some point, it would be ranged against not just India and Pakistan. It expected China to help Pakistan, but then it realized it wouldn't have US backing, turns to the Soviet Union and signs a treaty of friendship. And so you see kind of how that moment of divergence between suddenly now the US sees China as a partner, and India sees China as a big problem. And so you start to see this divergence again. You then go into this period, the final period that the book really covers in my book, which is kind of disengagement. It looks at the period about 73 to 79, where you see the India and the US kind of get back to a somewhat stable engagement or relationship after, they had 72 was spent a lot of yelling at each other about the post-1971 situation. But for both sides, they were on a different page on China to a large extent. But the other thing is, because China was no longer a US adversary, the US didn't feel a need for India anymore. And so it starts there's this level of disinterest and unraveling disengagement. India, meanwhile, now had the Soviet Union as that insurance policy against China. But very quickly, one thing you do see that then plays out over the rest of the last few decades we've seen is that India does not want to become over-dependent on the Soviet Union. And so what it does do is try to stabilize two things. They try to stabilize relations during the Ford administration and the Carter administration with the United States, so that they're not too dependent just on Russia. But Morarji Desai, who becomes Indian Prime Minister in 77, calls genuine non-alignment. And on the same track, they start to stabilize relations for the first time after the 62 war with China. China is also interested in this because they don't have an interest in India getting too close to the Soviet Union. And so, these relationships are all very connected. And you do see 1976, China and India exchange ambassadors. And then Foreign Minister Vajpayee in 1979 travels to China. But it is my book comes full circle. It ends at this period. So you see between US and India, this is a period of large disengagement. But you do see a moment of convergence where between the US and India, where both sides actually want the India-China relationship to be more stable. And my book ends with a meeting between Jimmy Carter, then president in 1979, in April 1979, and Foreign Minister Vajpayee, where it's Carter who's encouraging India to keep trying to be friendly and engage with China. Whereas in 1949, 30 years earlier, it had been Nehru who was trying to tell Truman that you should engage with China. And of course, Vajpayee, 20 years after that, just about 22 decades after that 79 meeting, becomes Indian Prime Minister, and really heralds this current phase that we're seeing of the US-India-China triangle.
Wow, fascinating, history, and I was reading it and I was really amazed at some of the connections that one would never make because one doesn't have access to historical documents, and the way you have pearl them all together. It's amazing. So you've mentioned about Pakistan. So my next two questions are about Pakistan, and I would like you to say something about it. So you have written, you've posed a question that had India's China policy affected the US decision to ally with Pakistan. And then you write that Robert J. McMahon has argued that American disillusionment with and devaluation of India was definitely a necessary precondition for it. What are your views on the beginning of Pak-US alliance? And was the US disappointment with India with respect to China the reason for US looking favorably at Pakistan at that time? Because it would be important for us in Pakistan to understand the beginning of our alliance with the US, how much of it was, can be attributed to that period in time. And while we are on the subject of Pakistan, I would also like to know, so from 62, with the US telling India that it would even intervene on its behalf against China, we moved to 1971, 9 years later, USS Enterprise in Bay of Bengal. So was that a surprise for India? What do the archives say about it? And how do you interpret this flip in less than a decade? How do you see it?
Um, Great question, Rabia. So, it's really interesting in that beginning period. What a number of other historians have also shown, especially the more recent books that have written on US India, is that there was a very different conception in almost the way the US now divides India and Pakistan, CENTCOM versus PACOM or Indo-PACOM view, that Pakistan was considered important vis-a-vis the Middle East. And in the post-Second World War context, the Middle East, because of its oil, was considered, and a lot of the US views of this region were shaped by Britain. And Britain kind of dragged the US along in terms of a lot of that prism was shaped by kind of not just kind of Britain itself, but how they saw different parts of the world. And so you do see kind of an interest in the US to ensure some kind of, but they largely left it to Britain, and the idea was that Pakistan was important vis-a-vis the Middle East. But what you do see is, for them, India was kind of the bigger, especially once China falls. Because if you look at 1947, both the CIA and State Department do analysis of countries. They have these categories of importance for the US. And India is in the category of least importance in both those studies in 1947, because it wasn't considered, the focus of the Cold War was Europe largely. India wasn't considered important in terms of, it wasn't considered to have industrial military capacity or resources. Once China falls, once Asia becomes more of kind of the focus, India is the big prize. And so they try, and all this while, Pakistani leaders are trying to get, there's already a relationship with Britain, are trying to get more aid from, especially after the 47-48 India-Pakistan crisis, are trying to attract more interest from the US. And so you see in the early 50s, a lot of kind of solicitation of, look, let's have a better relationship with Pakistan. But you see a largely disinterested US in that. Because especially in that kind of 49 or so period, you see kind of a lot of interest in India. And so had in that, I mean, these are counterfactuals and you never know, but had India at that point actually, say, signed up with the US, whether an alliance or closer relationship, that would have shaped kind of what, the hyphenation might have worked the opposite way in the early 50s. But once India made very clear that, look, it wasn't going to ally, and the Korean War really hardened views of the Cold War in the US. And at that point, in kind of that 53-54 period, when you have, the other thing is you have this spirit of alliances, right? They used to call it John Foster Dulles' Pactomania. That actually fit very well. And there was an unwilling India and a very, very willing Pakistan. And so Pakistan took advantage of the opportunity and, established that relationship. So there was a China angle in the sense that, you can always say they would have missed opportunities. You can argue it in hindsight, and I think that's absolutely true. And I still think that the Indian government might have made the same decisions that they knew in hindsight. But I think that's why I think, I talk about the triangle, but throughout the book, you see that both Pakistan and the Soviet Union or Russia today have this impact on this triangle and how it plays out. And you see this in the second kind of period you asked about, which is from 62 to 71. I think for India, I mean, it's quite interesting. This air defense agreement that had been alluded to in kind of a lot of previous work, or not even mentioned in some, was signed in kind of 1963, I believe, if I remember correctly, in July, between the US and India. And what this was an agreement that if China attacked India again, that the US would, and it was a very one-sided assurance, that the US would then get into mutual consultations with India in order to see how it could help India. No obligation on the part of India to do anything if the US was attacked. And this also meant, had laid out in it, kind of a defense and intelligence, kind of both equipment, resources, reconnaissance agreements within this, understanding within this. And so if you look at that period after that, in 65, for example, at one point, the US asked India, when China was threatening to intervene on behalf of Pakistan in the 65 war, India was quite concerned. In fact, India was more concerned in 1965 about potential Chinese intervention than it was in 71. It actually asked for US help when the US asked, does India want to invoke this air defense agreement? And by the time kind of they went back and were discussing this with Delhi, the situation got sorted out. But the US did kind of put pressure on China privately at the time. So this air defense agreement, this assurance actually did have, and you see it in US Defense Department documents, they both had operational plans for how to help India if necessary. But also when they used to list kind of US assurances, obligations in the region, the kind of India, or at least assurance was mentioned in that list. And so this kind of, while a lot of people didn't know about it outside government, this kind of assurance did exist. In 71, what kind of, and it's more an implicit assurance. In 71, what India finds is that there are a couple of conversations that Indian officials have with then National Security Advisor Kissinger in particular, where he, when they're discussing, what happens if there's a war between India and Pakistan and China intervenes, what will the US do if China attacks India? And the answers they get from Kissinger are a little bit wishy-washy, very uncertain. So it leaves them very uncertain. And then you see, because now we have access to the Indian archives or the Indian papers, that it sets up a huge concern amongst Indian officials. This is, what will we do? And so they did two things. One, they're genuinely worried from a strategic perspective. But the second thing it does is it strengthens the hands of those within the Indian system who'd argued for a closer partnership with the Soviet Union, which had been trying to get India to sign at that point for 2 years, a treaty of friendship that had mutual consultations built in. And also kind of committed India to helping the Soviets if they were attacked. And so you saw, once it became at least clear, or at least, and then once it becomes public that Kissinger had gone to China with Pakistani help, as that becomes clear, India decides that it cannot depend on the US anymore. And so it goes ahead. Indira Gandhi had been against signing that treaty because she thought it would be against non-alignment. She approves, and India signs the treaty with the Soviet Union. So it really does, in that space, as you said, in less than a decade, it kind of there's a total switch in, they would say correlation of forces in the region, but you do see kind of at least kind of musical chairs in terms of partnerships playing out in the region.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the answers. I think, there needs to be a book written by an Indian and a Pakistani academic as to how Kissinger dealt with India and Pakistan. That book is begging to be written, literally, because there's so much material out there as to how this guy dealt with the two countries over a span of...
You can even use tapes. You have audio tapes available, so you can even have
it would be a fascinating
live commentary over it.
Absolutely. So when I was reading your book, and this discussion about losing India to communism comes up frequently. Also, President Johnson not wanting to leave that legacy and fail on that count. It made me wonder whether the US ever thought about losing Pakistan to China. I know perhaps Pakistan being an Islamic republic and not ideologically, theologically available to fall for communism might be the reason it wasn't so pronounced in US thinking. With India being secular and that ideological religious bent wasn't there, thus the concerns have some roots. So this is just off the topic. I was reading and I was thinking, did the US ever think that it could lose Pakistan to China, which it might think today that it has lost Pakistan to China?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because they did actually. So they were concerned, though Pakistan had signed, was part of both the Baghdad Pact, the Central, and CETO, and so technically an ally, but there was this deep frustration in the US that while the US, that Pakistan had signed on, and CETO was anti-China, that it really for Pakistan was more about India. And the frustration in Pakistan, which you see in the conversations between Pakistani and American officials, but the Pakistanis say, well, why doesn't this apply to when we're fighting with India? And the US said, no, it does not apply. But you do see kind of these concerns about Pakistan getting too close to China. But it was, and so there was concern about losing Pakistan to China. And so you do see both in terms of persuasion, but also in terms of very clear talking on the part of American officials that, look, your military assistance is there because you are part of this China, this part of this anti-China coalition. So, trying to shape Pakistani, like how far and fast Pakistan would go. But they also found themselves helpless on that beyond a point, because much to both Kennedy and Johnson's, and Johnson has some choice words which you can listen to on tapes about both Pakistan and Ayub Khan, where he is extremely frustrated about the growing Pakistan-China relationship. And so to some extent, you do see the sense that they have been very concerned about losing, but then you hear White House officials saying, look, we've already lost them to some extent, so they're going to be play one off against the other as well. So I think there was that sense, because in those days losing anybody, I think India was different because it was considered one of these large dominoes, and domino theory you couldn't. So I think it was more countries in Asia as well looked at India as an Asian country. And this is where it is kind of interesting how that divide between, the border between India and Pakistan seems to have become the border between Asia, even though, most South Asians consider both Afghanistan and Pakistan very much part of Asia, not to mention the Middle East also being considered part of Asia.
True. So I got this quote in my book, well, not exactly my book, but the Pak US chapter when I was researching, where Johnson tells Ayub that, it's not an exact quote, but to the effect that, US is, a man can have an affair, but the man does not need to tell the wife about the mistress. So you keep your affair separate, alluding to that US was the wife and China could be the mistress, and the twain should not meet or know about each other. So that was really fascinating. It happened after 65 war when Ayub met. And it was amazing how Johnson had categorized the relationship that the wife knows about the mistress, but will ignore it. So so thank you so much for talking about how there were concerns about Pakistan as well back then. So taking a cue from the discussion about India in your book being a counter attraction versus India being a counterbalance to China, I want you to talk a bit about the state of Indo-U.S. efforts to challenge China in the region. Is there a visible difference between the means and approaches towards dealing with China between India and the US, like it was during most of the period that you've covered in your book?
So it's interesting, you do see, I think on the broad kind of level, I think you do see convergence between the US and India, a lot of similar concerns about Chinese behavior in particular, combined with, when you have a rising China, it has more resources and more reach. And so you see kind of a lot of convergence there. Also a fair amount of convergence on certain approaches. I think you do see, though, some differences. I think you see differences in terms of how ideologically both countries see it. I think the US, especially in the last few months, it is seeing China now, and as China as well has talked about its model, where earlier used to say socialism with Chinese characteristics, now has talked about exporting its model. And so you're seeing this kind of ideological dimension of this competition play out, where till very recently, and even till now, you do see India trying to kind of stay out of that ideological battle largely. So, how this might play out is kind of, but that ideological dimension, I think, is one difference. I think there is a difference in terms of some approaches. So for example, on the economic side, India and the US actually have a lot of similar concerns, as do some European countries, the Japanese, about Chinese economic practices, trade deficits, market access for their companies. So basically they say it's not a reciprocal economic relationship. But India has concerns about China, about the US taking a very unilateral approach, particularly with the Trump administration imposing tariffs that have also ended up hurting India. And so I think that approach is also a concern. I think there's also a difference in terms of intensity. India likes a US-China kind of dynamic that is like a little bit Goldilocks. They want them to be not, too cold and too icy, because then India has to make choices, and not, too warm and close, because then India is out of the picture, and like 1971 kind of is left hanging out on the outside and potentially hurt by that G2, as people call it. And so, what is seen is that with the US-China relationship getting more intense, this will require some choices of India that India doesn't necessarily want to have to make right now. So I think there are those differences. I think there is another difference, which is that, both countries have questions about the others, much like kind of the mid-60s that I talked about. They have questions about the other's willingness and ability to play a role in this balancing strategy vis-a-vis the other. And so you see kind of India concerned that the US, either there'll be talk of retrenchment from Asia, or that President Trump will strike a deal with Xi Jinping, and there'll be a G2 that will kind of throw India and Japan and Australia and others under the bus. So there is this question about, is the US committed to playing this role? Is committed to having a presence in kind of the Indo-Pacific area? Whereas the US has concerns about India's ability, either because its economic growth isn't fast enough, its military capabilities aren't therefore growing fast enough, but does it have the capability, or is it too distracted by kind of domestic issues to be able to play that role that the US wants it to, much like the questions it was played on. And one final difference I would say is that I'd highlight is the role of Russia, where India sees Russia as part of its balancing strategy vis-a-vis China. Whereas the US, in its national defense strategy, its national security strategy, at least the Trump administration, has clubbed the Chinese and the Russians together, and they do have a close partnership at the moment, but they've clubbed them together as revisionist powers. And so now it's kind of a reverse of what we saw earlier. India sees Russia as part of its, actually not so reverse, but echoes of the past. India sees Russia as part of its China solution. The US sees Russia as part of its China problem. So I'd say those are kind of the differences. But so far, you've seen the convergence that's really kind of continued to drive. And I often say, look, I said it the other day, Beijing can take a bow. It has played Cupid between the US and India, because as Indian concerns and as US concerns about China have grown, they have managed these differences to be able to actually come together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very useful, response to put the contemporary situation in context. So you have talked about in your book, development versus defense, right? So is the development versus defense tussle still a thing between India and the US when it comes to China? Or are both countries still in agreement to the centrality of a military leg in their partnership against China? And what are the implications of this for Sino-Indo ties? So how do you look at that?
Sure. So in the 60s, it was somewhat different. India was very much kind of, the economy hadn't been doing well. It was still kind of a developing country in many ways today as well, but, very different power differential then. And very much dependent on foreign aid. And the US had wanted, their concern was that militarily they could help out, but that India would end up collapsing because its economy would fail. And then if its economy would fail, Indians would say, how come communist China is succeeding? Our democratic government can't help us. So maybe we should turn to communism. And so the US was very keen that India spend more money on development and not divert more of that spending to defense. The Indian leadership, which has just been going to come out of a defeat in the China-India war, was insistent that they had to spend money on defense. And so this was a problem. The other problem in those times, which is still, I think, a problem, is this question of where India was actually going to buy defense equipment from. And that you still see today, which is that US wanted India to buy more from the US and its allies, and India wanted to have a more diversified range of partnerships, including buying from the Soviet Union, but also quite interested in developing a defense, indigenous defense industrial base, which the Soviets were willing to help with, including with MiG fighter aircraft. And so I think you see that aspect even today. Not so much the development defense playing out in that sense, but you still do see differences about, how the US would like to see build up defense capabilities. But you also see, I think to some extent, some concern that without, and this is a different sort of concern about the development aspect or the economic aspect, which is there's concern sometimes in the US that if India doesn't grow at the speed that it needs to, that if it doesn't institute the reforms, etc., it will not have the resources, given the growing power differential across the board. I mean, at certain points, the boundary, India has a better balance with China, but that overall, if the capabilities gap between China and India will grow, if India does not have the resource to be able to fund that, whether it's infrastructure building, whether it's a naval capability, whether it's military capability at the boundary, and so that aspect is there. I would say actually, interestingly, I think that this defense and security dimension of the US-India relationship is just one element of it. In some way, India and the US have a far more balanced relationship than they did during much of the Cold War, including the period where there was convergence. Because you see, in those days, it was kind of heavily economic assistance based, and then, yes, military. Now you see kind of there is the defense and security leg, but there's also very much an economic leg that is not necessarily government driven. It's been, private sectors, it's a trading relationship. The US is India's largest trading partner. And a lot of US investment, and now Indian investment coming into the US. And then you do have that people-to-people aspect, which frankly actually makes this this relationship different for India than it does. India's relationship for Russia does not have that people-to-people aspect. The Indian relationship with China certainly doesn't. But I do think, China has had concerns about the US-India security and defense relationship in particular. But I don't know if they don't recognize it or they just have other priorities, but my sense has always been that the one country that can actually do the most to limit US-India defense ties, because it is most adversely affected by them, is China. That if China actually, and I've always wondered about the missed opportunity that Xi Jinping might have had when Prime Minister Modi first came to office, and had said he wanted to do business with China, had worked traveled to China a lot as chief minister. But between 2014 and 2015, I think there was an opportunity, I think, for Xi Jinping to say, look, if the US is my larger adversary, if I actually resolve the boundary, get to a better kind of modus vivendi with India, I can actually help limit the relationship. But what we've instead seen, and at that time, those plans kind of went awry, both because of the boundary incident in September 2014, while Xi Jinping was in India, but also, and we'll come to this later, I'm sure, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and him kind of very much endorsing it himself, making it very much part of the Belt and Road. And so I think you do see kind of that, that dimension play a role. And whether it was that or Doklam, the 2017 China-India-Bhutan crisis, the Tri-Junction crisis, you've seen that as India has been concerned about those incidents, it's actually ended up becoming closer to the US. So China can, in some ways, India hasn't got even closer to the US because it likes to maintain its independence, but also because it does not want to provoke China beyond a point. But now you hear an argument amongst some, Ambassador Sham Saran, former foreign secretary, said this recently, which is, look, if China is doing these things and pressuring us anyway, then why are we putting limits on ourselves? Why are we allowing China to veto? So does it affect Sino-Indian ties? Absolutely. But I actually think, in this, I don't know if it's too late now or if Beijing thinks it's too late, but I do think it has, without China, you would not have seen this defense and security relationship as close. But I think this is also a cause of concern, as we read on the pages of the Global Times every day, much concern to the Chinese. But I think this is the wrong, they're not going to have too much of a voice or audience in India right now for them to say, you shouldn't fear us. We're not a threat, and so you should, not be friends with the US or Japan or Australia.
All right. Yeah, this is. I don't think so. I don't know how much seriously Global Times is taken in India. It is certainly, like I think you said on Twitter, that ship has sailed. It's too late for China to now say, "Don't fear us." So thank you so much. Very very useful response to the question. I would now like to move to something which you've talked about in your book, diversification. And I was reading your bio. Your next project is also on that. I think it's a very useful area of research. So you've done an excellent job in your book contextualizing India's non-alignment by deftly bringing to the fore alliance versus diversification argument, something that had been and it continues to be a cause of concern for Washington. So, how can this inclination towards diversification rather than firmly aligning with one country shapes Sino-Indo ties going forward? And not only Sino-Indo ties, just generally how U.S. India handles its foreign policy alliances. So something on that. Do let our viewers know as to how have you operationalized diversification. What do you mean when you say diversification?
Okay. Thanks for noticing that in particular. It is, and one of the reasons I'm developing it into a monograph is because I think, there's a lot of, it's not something that's got a lot of people have noticed when they read the book because it ends up being more about the triangle, but it is a theme that I am developing into kind of this longer thesis, which is that, diversification, what I say is, people focus on non-alignment. So it's easy to say, well, there's no Cold War anymore, so it's irrelevant. But if you think about it, one of the most consistent elements of Indian foreign policy across governments, whether left-wing, right-wing, coalitions, has been its desire to maintain a diversified portfolio of partnerships rather than exclusive alliance. And even when, that does not mean those relationships with those multiple partners are equal. This is not a hub and spoke sort of system. India does align, it does tilt within these partnerships, but it does not kind of sign up to the alliances. And the reason I wanted to kind of do a little bit more and elaborate on this in a monograph is people are very curious about this question of why India doesn't do alliances. And so this is kind of an attempt to kind of talk about why, whether it shows up as non-alignment, whether it shows up as what people call multi-alignment these days. Somebody came up with the omni-something alliance, and I was thinking this was getting out of hand. But essentially, why India kind of strives for kind of maintaining a balance between these partnerships. And I think it comes from this. And so what I point out is, think about it as what underlay non-alignment, which is this is India has had a diversification strategy where it maintains multiple partnerships, not all equal, but the idea behind it is to avoid the downsides of dependence, which is India as a post-colonial country initially, I mean, this was developed in that context, wanted to be able to preserve its ability. And at that time, coming from a place of weakness, wanted to be able to preserve as much autonomy, freedom of decision-making as possible. And the idea had been, how do you do that as a weak country? So one is by you try to reduce dependence, but then I think most Indian, so you'd reduce dependence by either reducing your threat, so you don't need the other countries, or you build your own capabilities. The other way for doing it, recognizing that for India then, and frankly today, reducing dependence has had its limit. No country is self-sufficient, and India does have concerns in terms of China. So it has tried to limit its kind of threat, the threat from China by engaging with China, by kind of giving China incentive to deal with it, including economic incentive. But at the same time, you can't reduce dependence. So what do you do then? You diversify the dependence, and you diversify it by having multiple partners. And the reason, so that you can play one off against the other, but if one country decides that they want to put pressure on you, you can depend on others. The fundamental feeling amongst Indian policymakers since the start that external actors are unreliable, not because they're bad people, bad countries, but because they have their own interests. And so for India, 1962, 1971, you'd think these things would show them you see the downside of diversification during these moments, but they also, in both those instances, as soon as they can, started diversifying again as soon as the situation was stable. It's because Indian policymakers want to maintain their own freedom of decision, freedom of action, but also because they think that if they ally with just one country, they will have to not just go along with those countries and the decisions made in, say, Washington, or they will, be kind of susceptible to changes in mind. And so for India, it watches the unreliability, uncertainty around the Trump administration and how it's even treating allies, and says, look, we were justified in being diversified in our number of partnerships. And so I think how it's playing out today is, I think the US-China competition is just going to be fundamentally different for India to deal with than US-Soviet competition. Because now here's a country that India has its own problems with in forms of China. India's disputes with China have very little to do with the US. They are bilateral issues, sometimes, in the region, etc. But these are not problems that the US has created. This is China and India have been at each other's throats for a while. For India, therefore, it's going to have to figure out this. So its current version of diversification is, yes, a very close partnership with the US, but also keeping Russia within that basket of partners and building out a set of relationships with countries like Australia, with Japan, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with France, who are not just kind of strategic partners, but also economic partners, the source of military supplies for India, etc. So, diversification is essentially a way for India to try to maintain autonomy, so to speak. But no country is purely autonomous, and diversification has its downsides because diversification only works when other countries think of you as important. If multiple countries don't think of you as important, then you have to end up depending on one side or the other.
Excellent. I think Pakistan has some lessons to learn from this. I can't wait for your monograph to come out and read that. So I'll pose one more question, which I found really fascinating in your book, and I can't wait to hear your reply before I move to the contemporary part of our discussion. So your book highlights the impact of Pakistan on the Fateful Triangle during the Cold War. You've quoted a May 1959 intelligence estimate indicating that a joint India-Pakistan effort could materialize if they perceived a direct Chinese threat. If we were to do a counterfactual, because obviously, where's the fun without it? Do you think there was ever a chance in history of Indo-Pak relations where India and Pakistan would have come together against the Chinese threat? You have also quoted a US assessment when India and Pakistan began drafting the Indus Water Treaty in 1959, and that it was perhaps because of the Chinese threat. So that's really interesting. Can you give us your sense of that assessment?
So it's interesting. I mean, the counterfactual, was it possible? You can see now in hindsight why it wouldn't be. But I think even at the time, there were people who essentially said in the administration in the US, there wasn't going to be. I mean, it's not like they didn't come close. Ayub and Nehru actually did discuss some sort of kind of joint defense. But I think the reality was why it didn't work is at the end of the day, both sides saw, they weren't seeing their kind of India-Pakistan issues through the prism of China, whereas the US was. The US was thinking about India-Pakistan through a Cold War prism, which meant if the two could, agree with each other, they could then work together in the free world, so to speak, against the Soviet Union and China. And if India felt that, and it would also, more importantly, from a resource perspective, that then they could stop spending money using weapons against each other or buying weapons to use against each other and focus either on their own development, economic development, or against China. That was the US prism. But, as we've seen, and this is the history of the Cold War is littered with it, but we see this in contemporary, that wasn't India and Pakistan's prism. They saw their kind of bilateral issues as very much from the prism of kind of post-partition, identity issues, land, territorial issues. And so when the US is coming in saying, and I think there was a very small window for this, between, that late 50s, maybe kind of before the war. This becomes impossible in kind of 62, 63 when the China-Pakistan border talks start. At that point, it's just, and during the 62 war, India actually found Pakistan to be very unhelpful, was very concerned that Pakistan would jump in and start another, and the US was very concerned about it. The Kennedy administration made very clear to Pakistan that if Pakistan did even any distracting action during the 62 India-China war, that there would be consequences. So I think 62, 63 by then it becomes impossible. But I think at that point, that's partly because Ayub had decided that, look, India's actually benefited from doing this diversification thing. India's getting kind of aid from the Soviets and the Americans. Why shouldn't we? And at that point had also been concerned, as Pakistan has been in the last few years, complained to the US, listen, why are you getting close to the US, to India? That you are now seeing India as your big strategic partner, and you're not taking care of us as much. So we're going to, it might have actually started, the Pakistan-China relationship might have actually started as a signal to the US to try to say, give us more and we won't do this, but ended up developing into this real kind of long-term partnership. So I think the counterfactual, yes, if I think India and Pakistan had seen this through a similar prism. And I think there was a brief period where Nehru was willing, because he started to recognize what a big challenge China was going to pose. But what the two sides would have needed to do to be able to get to that agreement, I think was impossible. And for Nehru, there was no way after when there were those 5-6 rounds of border talks after the 62 war between India and Pakistan, there was no way, having lost in China-India, in the China-India war, there was no way he could have made major concessions. So it is in some ways a story of India-Pakistan ties, which is sometimes when one side is willing, the other side isn't. And so I think it's an interesting counterfactual to play through. There are lots in the book that you can spot missed opportunities. I think this one, it's easier to understand why it didn't happen.
Excellent. Yeah, I also believe that Pakistan has these germs of diversification. And, with Ayub writing Friends Not Masters was a clear signal that, there are others that we should look at. And that was the beginning of, our looking at China while still receiving stuff from, United States to fight the Chi-Coms while we were talking to the Chi-Coms.
And then eventually also the Soviets. I mean, I think people sometimes forget this is, it's 65 is when kind of Pakistan starts reaching out to the Soviet Union as well. And the Soviet Pakistan, Johnson was not just hopping mad with Ayub Khan for going to China, but he was also hopping mad because I think Ayub went to the Soviet Union as well. And then the Soviets eventually gave Pakistan military aid, I think right up to 69, 70.
Yeah, when we were under embargo, right?
Yeah.
US. So a lot of interesting, history there. Okay, so we'll just step outside from history, move on to the contemporary. I have 3 questions relating to the contemporary, and then we'll wrap it up. The first is about Ladakh. So a lot is happening there. I want to know your assessment of the situation. I know it's very current. A lot of information is coming in, but not a lot of it is public. So what is your assessment? How much of it is related to BJP's decision to announce Ladakh as a union territory, going back to August 5th decision? In a recent paper for Brookings, you have talked about India's competitive engagement with China. So how will this current crisis affect India's balancing act between conflict and cooperation with China? So if you can look at it from that angle as well.
Sure. So, the paper that I did for Brookings, it's called Managing China-India's competitive engagement with Indian characteristics. The point I tried to make is that, look, the Wuhan summit in 2018, the Chennai or the Mamallapuram summit late last year, these are, part of the kind of dual track strategy that India has vis-a-vis China, which is the engagement. Those show you the engagement part, both countries' interest in stabilizing relationship. But what kind of this talk of Wuhan spirit, etc., kind of overlooked often, or not amongst the policymakers who were quite clear, but amongst a lot of people talking about it, which was that none of the fundamental differences between the two countries, China and India, had been resolved during this time. Some had been alleviated, but the fundamental problems remain, and it would require a real strategic rethink on the part of both countries to address those, or have a willingness to. And I think what you're seeing with the boundary crisis is a reflection of that those problems still exist, and that both sides have concerns about the other. So I'm, and just briefly to kind of what is happening, I think one of the things I'm hesitant to do, just because, this is maybe my historian's training, and thankfully, Brookings gives me the luxury of not having to comment write an op-ed every day, and to do a little bit more kind of, thinking about these issues, is I'm hesitant to speculate about what's actually going on, because we don't know. There, intermittent sources, is drip, drip, drip. We don't know if we're getting complete information. You always have to, when you're thinking about the sources themselves, who are they, why are they leaking, what is the visibility they have on the issue? And we don't have very much from the Chinese side. So, I mean, the broad contours, I think, of what we know is that there has been a change in the status quo. What that change is, we don't know the precise, that there are these instances across kind of eastern Ladakh, where we're seeing these kind of boundary face-offs. Some people have talked about intrusions. We don't know the details, but that essentially there has been a change in status quo. Both sides have different versions. The Chinese are talking about change in status quo because India is building a road, not in territory China claims, but they are concerned about that. India, at least from Indian sources, have said, well, China is, at least I'll stick to what we know from the foreign ministries, that they said that there's been at least a change in status quo with China preventing Indian patrolling where it has traditionally been. And so we do know there's been, kind of a change in status quo. We also know that it is fairly serious. It is fairly serious because of a few different reasons. And what makes this different from, say, the 2013 and 2014 instances, which were the other bilateral. Doklam in 2017 was different because it involved Bhutanese and kind of land that Bhutan claims, not India didn't have any claims. But why do I say that it is serious? I think it's serious because, and again, we know it's serious. We don't know how serious it is because we don't know. But it is serious because there are certain differences from 2013, 2014. One is the number of different face-off sites. Usually it's kind of 1 point. Maybe you'll see during Doklam, we saw some activity around the Pangong So as well, the famous video of people like scuffling with each other. But I think this time, you're seeing it, at least from what we have heard, is at least at 3 different points: the Pangong So Lake, the hot springs sector, and then up near the where the Shok and Galwan River meet. And so the fact that it's happening on so many, some have even said, look, earlier that month there was an issue in Sikkim as well at Nakulam. Second, these are points that have not generally seen these kinds of disputes or these face-offs. They're constantly face-offs between India and China. Each side accuses the other of transgressions. They use the word transgressions because this is often an area both sides claim. And so the fact that it's been at spots, especially that the point at Galwan and in Hot Springs, that haven't been kind of these points of these face-offs before. So I think second, that's the difference. Third, the scale of the buildup. Now, but again, we're not hearing what's happening on the Indian side, but the usual thing is that when China builds up, India builds up as well. So we don't know the chronology of who built up when, but regardless, the number of troops involved, whatever you believe in terms of numbers, I think most people are acknowledging, including former senior officers, kind of military, who in military leadership, including General Narasimhan, Lieutenant General Narasimhan, who is also a China hand and is with the National Security Advisory Board of India, and people like General Huda, who used to be Northern Army Commander. And so these are people who know. They're also very sober people, but they are saying, look, the scale of this in terms of numbers and what has been moved up to power. And I would say finally, another kind of different that makes us serious is something both those generals mentioned, which is the level of aggressiveness. And so I think, each of these things put in the context of, the usual thing that's even always mentioned in India-Pakistan crises is, two nuclear powers. Now, the good thing, to the extent they're good things, or say the more positive signs is that, and all this is taking place in a boundary that's undemarcated, unlike the LOC, the line of control between India and Pakistan. And so I think the somewhat positive things that you could say are, if nothing else, at least signs that would say two sides perhaps have an interest in sorting this out. We don't know where this goes. But is that, one, they actually have this very elaborate set of mechanisms and protocols that actually the extent of which do not exist on the India-Pakistan side, that do kind of provide a roadmap of how these things are actually talked through. And they're now dialoguing both at the military and the diplomatic level. Second, unlike what we saw in Doklam, which was a departure for the Chinese, standard practice for both governments in these things has been to keep quiet. They don't say very much. Twitter can go crazy, but the two sides don't say very much. That leaves them, the ambiguity, or the kind of leaves them, I think, a certain amount of flexibility to actually resolve it, takes pressure off. In Doklam, we saw departure. The Chinese went public and they kept up the rhetorical pressure, not just through Global Times or People's Daily, but from the Chinese Foreign Ministry itself. We're not seeing that this time. We are seeing this essentially, other than one or two things, the governments themselves have largely remained, kept the kind of rhetoric down. And finally, I'd say a difference that actually, it's all relative, but makes it somewhat easier to perhaps deal with, is that this is a bilateral issue, whereas Doklam, for example, involved Bhutan as well, and that always makes it more complicated. So I think that's where kind of things stand. This is playing out. There's a lot of discussion about Chinese motivations. And I think, again, maybe this is my training as a historian. I don't often need to find one single cause for, I think it often plays out and there's a proximate cause, but there are other factors that are kind of regional. So, just very briefly, because I know I've been going on a bit too long, but we've heard different sets of kind of explanations. One has been kind of domestic Indian development, so to speak, that whether it was what you mentioned, kind of Article 370 and India saying, look, outside China is ours, and kind of reinforcing that, or, and we've heard this a little bit more, that it's been India infrastructure building, that as it's building this road that will give it better access, a more comprehensive access, not just to Daulat Beg Oldi up near the Karakoram Pass, but also kind of better access to supply its troops and even put troops into near the LSC, that it's that road building that the Chinese have saw. Then there's a kind of other set of bilateral issues that those are the kind of domestic developments, so to speak, that people have pointed to. Set of bilateral issues that China is either upset with India for getting too close to the US, or for its new economic scrutiny of Chinese investments, or about the role India might play in, or the kind of anti-China sentiment growing in during this coronavirus era. You have the regional explanations that China has been assertive in a number of different places, with Japan in the South China Sea, with Taiwan and Hong Kong, that it's generally assertive. People disagree about why. Is it being assertive because it sees a window of opportunity, this is a sign of strength? Or is it that Xi Jinping needs to show that it's out of insecurity, that China's not on the back foot from COVID? And then, you could see the global dynamics, and, some have made the argument that this is about the US and China, that China wants to, weaken an American partner. And so this is about sending a signal. And so you see this whole range of explanations. And to me, anybody who tells you they know for sure why this has happened, I'm skeptical of that, because I think it's too soon to tell. We're still debating why Doklam happened, or the 2013 and 2014 incidents happened. So I think we're not going to find out for sure. It is important, though, to know why for policymakers, because without knowing what the Chinese want, it's not quite clear what the solution to this will be. So I think one of the things these diplomatic discussions are about, these negotiations, is to actually figure out, for the Indian side, to figure out what do the Chinese want and what are they willing to, what will India be willing to accept. So far, what they've said is they want a restoration of the status quo ante. We'll see where it falls.
Excellent. I think I'm really grateful for your training as a historian and not picking just one point and saying that you know for sure. That's brilliantly
Also,
articulated.
where would be the fun in that, Ravi?
Absolutely. So thank you so much. I think you've mentioned a whole range of issues, and it's still an evolving situation. I guess we'll find more, but it would be interesting to know as to which of the explanations gains more traction as time passes by. My second last question to you is about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I would want to know your perspective as to how do you look at the Pak-China relations and what are some of the Indian reservations with China-Pakistan economic corridor? Do you think that that has any implications for Indo-Pak relations? Is there a China factor in Indo-Pak relations given CPEC? So just your views on that.
So I think, one of the things is that I think India's view, and there was a debate in India a few years ago, I think less so now, but there was a debate in India about, how India should see the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And it's related to the India-Pakistan question. But I think largely people saw, especially from the security side, they saw the China-Pakistan economic corridor from the prism of how they saw the broader China-Pakistan relationship, which is that they had a lot of concerns about it, that now, that it was going to actually be the vehicle for China-Pakistan relations to become even closer. And that China, which had, to some extent, occasionally, used its leverage with Pakistan to either de-escalate crisis or even put pressure on certain, that it would no longer be willing to do that. And this would actually give Pakistan leverage with China for the first time in many, many decades, if for the first time ever. And so I think there was concern at kind of a strategic level that, look, this was going to make China-Pakistan relations much closer. And therefore, from an operational perspective, this would mean, an Indian military that in any case plans for a two-front war having to think about that, but also that the China-Pakistan economic corridor was not just about kind of the corridor, but worrying about things like, development of Gwadar, for example, and what that would mean from an operational perspective. But also, for example, and this is related to the current crisis, which is the Karakoram highway linking the two countries, that there would be much more development. That brings me to the other concern, which is for India, because of some of the projects in Gilgit-Baltistan, it was because it was kind of disputed territory. So, for example, India will never actually recognize, or at least one should never say never, but one of its major kind of hesitation for why it has not endorsed the Belt and Road and will not is because it sees CPEC as China infringing on kind of this territory that India considers its own. So there's a very specific point. I think the strategic thing is more kind of that it's led to a closer China-Pakistan relationship, and that China is now more invested in Pakistan in a way it has never been historically. From an operational perspective, it also means something different. So next time, and this is related to the India-Pakistan question, there are now more Chinese citizens and facilities in Pakistan. And so in the case of an actual India-Pakistan war, suddenly now China has to be concerned, and India at the very least has to think about the fact that when it's targeting places, that there might be Chinese there who might be killed, which brings in a whole different level of complexity to this. So, both from a strategic and an operational perspective, this starts to matter. There has been kind of there had been a set of people, and I think some have still said, for two reasons, that India shouldn't either worry or should even encourage something like the growing China-Pakistan. That it would actually create, like they say, familiarity breeds contempt, but if not, at least not contempt, that it would actually breed some concern in Pakistan. And with the debate in Pakistan, and this is something even people in the US had kind of thought that, look, this is actually going to make China now more concerned about the things that all of us have been concerned about, which is more, wanting stability. But on the same time, it would actually make Pakistanis more concerned about, whether it was the kind of types of loans, interest rates, all those issues. That when you are suddenly so concerned that some of the complaints that Pakistanis had about, say, others who have become, other partners like the US, now they would start complaining more about the Chinese. So there've been a little bit of that. But look, and then you had seen, including some of India's realists, for example, Bharat Karnan, a bomb thrower if there ever was one. But he has always said, look, China is the bigger problem. India needs to actually find a way, a modus vivendi with Pakistan. And so, you have heard people saying, well, if Pakistani concerns about, China grow, or this is another reason that, India should actually stabilize relation. I think that view has not really caught traction. So I think the concern that people have, there is another kind of more China-related view that there is in India, is that China will get stuck in Pakistan, that it will end up not, realizing its own limits, like every other country has, in terms of either trying to get, I think people forget this about both India and Pakistan. Many powers have tried to get them to do what they want. It rarely it ever works. And that the Chinese were going to learn that with Pakistan as well. And so I think there was this little bit of sense that, okay, maybe, China would become more aware of its constraints, and so would limit. I think that's kind of gone away as well. And I think particularly over the last 6-8 months, if anything, and it has been a source of kind of concern, even as this kind of Wuhan spirit has continued, is China's backing of Pakistan on the question of Kashmir, and particularly kind of these trying to get the UN Security Council to discuss it. Also the role China played after the Pulwama attack and kind of Balakot last year, that I think over the last year, essentially there's a view that this China-Pakistan relationship is, and that China has doubled down on its backing of Pakistan.
Very interesting. So a lot of things you put on table. One of that I would, take forward is, building of Chinese stakes inside Pakistan as part of its deterrent strategy. There's a research paper somewhere there. So perhaps,
Get one of your students on it.
I know, something to think about. All right, thank you. With this, we move to the last question, and with this, we would wrap up our discussion. So US has been wanting India to play a bigger role in Afghanistan for some years now. I know Pakistan has had some reservations, does not feel comfortable with the larger Indian role in Afghanistan. Do you think India has lost some of that leverage with the US Taliban deal signed on February 29th? And how do you view the India Afghanistan equation playing in the context of Indo-U.S. and also India-China, because China is looking to gain influence post-U.S. troops withdrawal in the region. So if India does come in, how how do you look at that situation evolving in both, in bringing back the triangle into Afghanistan? How would you see that evolving?
So it's quite interesting because, a few years ago, you could have said that actually US and India and China had a agreement, an interest in stability in Afghanistan for different reasons, perhaps. And this was a subject of China-India discussions both bilaterally. They had discussions in Afghanistan, but also in the Russia-India-China trilateral. And so you saw kind of that, at least on the top line, that in terms of stability in Afghanistan, that every country benefited from it and wanted to see that continue. What you started to see then, though, is that there was a sense that you had the US and India in terms of what to do with the Taliban, how to approach it or not approach it. You saw kind of India finding that Russia, which had usually been on its side on this issue about not engaging with the Taliban, and for that matter, even Iran. So if you go back to the 80s, Russia and Iran, or the 90s, Russia, Iran, and India had actually been on one side on this. But India saw that Russia, Iran, China, Pakistan were on the same page vis-a-vis the Taliban, and the U.S. found that India was the only country other than that who had concerns about it. But I think now you found that India has found itself kind of the last man standing, so to speak. But it does have leverage with the Ghani government and with Abdullah Abdullah. And so, I think there is a sense that, and the US and India, I think one thing, I don't think India is pleased with the developments in terms of the US drawdown, but the US has been far more kind of bringing India into the discussions, updating it, briefing it far more than it used to in the past, and more consistently. And so you do see that aspect. So in the olden days, I think this would have been a major subject of difference. I think now there's recognition. You've heard the Indian foreign minister say, look, we recognize that the US has made a lot of sacrifices and this cannot be unending. It's just a manner of how this is done, that to make sure that the interests of particularly Afghans are protected, but also other regional actors. So I think you've now seen kind of, China is less, China, and the reason China and India had kind of common concerns is it would fit into their broader concerns about counterterrorism. But now China, because of, whether it's because of their own equation with the Afghans, whether it's because the relationship with Pakistan has got closer, whether because they have established a stronger and how presence in Xinjiang, they perhaps feel less need to kind of think about this in a different way. They're less worried about that Wakhan corridor, perhaps, because they feel they can control it better. They don't need kind of a broader coalition. And so I think India now has to, and this, I'm not an expert, but Rudra Chaudhary, who's the director of Carnegie India, has just written, in fact, I was just going through it this morning, a paper on India's options in Afghanistan. And I would suggest that for people thinking through, because the questions facing India, do you actually engage with the Taliban publicly? Because it's not like India has not behind the scenes, but do you systematically? What does that mean for your relationship? I am skeptical that India is going to put boots on the ground. I know people have talked about that again and again. I don't see it happening for a variety of reasons. But I think, so there's very much a debate on this. And I think it is going to continue to be a subject that is not going to go, I don't think it ever goes anywhere, but I think it will be something that the sides, all sides and all the countries will continue to discuss. Just today, another Russian official has actually said the same, has echoed actually what the American officials have, which is they'd like to see India engage with the Taliban. It's rare to see the Russians and Americans singing from the same hymn sheet, but that tells you kind of where things are. And I think at the end of the day, India's made a lot of investments in terms of roads, resources, trade, in kind of ensuring that this kind of democratically elected. You can talk about kind of the problems of the elections, etc., but that they do have an interest in these kind of that the Taliban, they still, I think the end goal, they do not want to see the Taliban take over. We could probably do another kind of entire event on that. I would not be the best speaker, but I think the concerns remain about what the Taliban alone in power would do. But I think this is the debate that will continue to play out. I think they're discussing it. And I would just again suggest Rudra Chaudhary's paper on this. He's looked at this for far more years than I have.
Thank you so much for pointing that paper out. We'll definitely check it out and suggest it to our viewers as well. We have covered so much of ground today. It is a fascinating book. I wish it was available in Pakistan and to broader readers. It has a broader readership in Pakistan. But we hope that with passage of time, as time passes, we might have more people getting access to it somehow. Well, the Kindle version is available, so I would suggest people to go through that. Thank you so much for your time and availability today, and for discussing at length some of these issues, which are very close to our heart. We think about India, China all the time in Pakistan, and we follow the news of what's happening. So it really helps, with the history and the perspective. It really helps to look at this triangle, based on your research, your experiences in the archives. So thank you so much for bringing all of that out. I really enjoyed our discussion, and it was a pleasure meeting you after so many years. I know we just met briefly in DC a couple of years ago, but it's been a pleasure talking to you on these subjects that you're an expert at, and looking forward to your future research work and to more such conversations between us. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Rabia. It was a real pleasure for me as well, not just from a professional perspective, as I said, but a personal one as well. I couldn't be happier. And thank you so much for taking the time and for hosting me as well.
Thank you, Tanvi. You take care. Be safe. It is tough times, not because of just Corona, but because of the protests happening all over the U.S. So stay safe, stay healthy. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye.